the big global trend that I thought was really interesting this year, and we did mention this in an earlier episode, and I don't think we're not being original in coming up with it. So many people have reflected on it. Is the enormous and pretty much universal anti-incumbent move across elections across the world in 2024. There have been quite a few years in my lifetime when people have tried to impose narratives on the global elections that have happened in that year, whether it's a sort of a global shift to the left or a global shift to the right or a progressive moment or a populist move across the world. These things are all overgeneralized. You can sort of draw a narrative to fit them, and they tend to be a little bit oversimplified. It's not oversimplified this year to say that all incumbent parties, I think without exception, in about more than 70 different elections around the world, the incumbent parties always did worse, which is really, really striking. And I think it tells you, obviously, those were parties of left and right and centre. There's no particular political pattern to those parties, and that tells you a lot, I think, about the state of the global economy and actually the state of the global populace in their overall satisfaction with government in general. The most obvious sort of cause of this that everyone has quite rightly, I think, remarked on is that inflation has been really high, and that means that everyone around the world has been paying more for goods and services than they have before, and that's put pressure on everybody's household budgets, and that's true in any continent, in any country, and does incumbent parties no good. But I think there's a few interesting lessons to be drawn from it, and one of the most interesting for me is that it means that all the parties that lost this year have been able to, and we've certainly seen this in the UK, and I'm sure we'll see it. I think we've seen it in the US. Certainly, we might see it in other countries as well. Has been able to take a little bit of comfort from it and to say, sure, we lost. We are of course disappointed about that, but it wasn't just our fault. There's nothing we could have done. There's an absolutely universal global tide here that we were part of, and somehow, in some cases, that enables them to cover up or slightly ignore some specific failings that all losing parties of all stripes always make. And certainly in the UK, there have been plenty of examples of the Tories talking about anti-incumbency when actually what they mean by that is really quite specific failures that are not international failures. They are particular things that they did that people do not like and that they shouldn't have done. And I think then there's a thing on the flip side as well, which is that those parties that won also can't necessarily take all the credit that they might like to. The Labour Party won big in the UK. It didn't just win big because Keir Starmer is a uniquely generationally charismatic political genius, because no one thinks that he is. He's a skilled leader who's sometimes underrated. But fundamentally, one of the reasons that the Labour Party won was one of the reasons why non-incumbent parties did very well across the world. And it'll be interesting to see how the Trump administration does, for example, in a world in which I think incumbents in general still have a lot of odds stacked against them. It's been really interesting to see the BJP do quite well in domestic elections since the general election. I think countering some of they didn't counter the trend at the general election, but they have since then, and that's a really interesting sort of counter to what's going on globally. In the UK, as I said before, the British Labour government is not a popular government at the moment, despite being quite new, and some of that is its own decisions, and it's certainly made some mistakes. But some of that is, I think, the wash through from the fact that it's really hard being a government at the moment, and governments are structurally at the moment more likely to be unpopular than popular. And one of the really interesting factors, certainly in the UK, in relation to listening to people who are supporting reform, the sort of the third or fourth party who won a few seats at the election, the successor to UKIP, is how many of their voters are less motivated by specific complaints about immigration, although they do care about that, about the state of public services, or they do care about that. They think that the cost of living is too high. Of course they do. But they just think that all politicians are the same. All politicians are corrupt. And one of the real lessons of a world in which incumbents of all parties are going backwards is that is fuel to a sort of a broader populist anti-politics sentiment globally, because it does look like politicians and political parties, whatever they do, are doomed to fail. And that maybe is bad news for democracy going forward.